Mustafa Akyol, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Michael Renaud, editor of Dispatch Faith. Mustafa is a senior fellow with the Cato Institute and author of several books, including the forthcoming book, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World, coming out in September, so fairly soon. Mustafa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. In July, you wrote an essay for Dispatch Faith, basically arguing that we need not choose between religion and the Enlightenment. And you kind of set up a conflict that we're seeing play out in several different arenas right now, particularly in the U.S., but elsewhere too. But you set that up kind of through the lens of a group called the New Atheists, which I think most folks are familiar with: Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, some of the most well-known proponents of that movement. But also, you kind of refer to a group known as the New Theists, and you criticize each group and how they kind of misunderstand how modern conceptions of the West, modern conceptions of the United States, really lead to greater flourishing. Mustafa, let's just start and kind of set that up a little bit. What do you think either of those groups miss?
Great question. And it was a pleasure to write that piece. And thanks for welcoming me to write that to Dispatch, by the way. I should maybe begin, Michael, with this. My own interest in the Enlightenment as a Muslim, actually, where does it come from? Then I will get to your question. I think it was 15 years ago, maybe 20 now, I read for the first time John Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration. And I read it with great fascination. And at the end, I said, oh my God, he's speaking about our issues, our being Muslim issues. Mm-hmm. Because at the time of John Locke, there was religious persecution in England. There was one true church imposed on others by the government and by the Commonwealth. And he was arguing that, religion should be left to civil society. It should not be based on coercion, and coercion doesn't even produce true piety and all. I said, these are the issues we're discussing right now in the Muslim world. And that gave me a kind of inspiration to look more deeper into this period called Enlightenment in Western history. And I ultimately became convinced that the Enlightenment had different sides. There was one represented by Locke or Mendelssohn or others who were trying to reconcile their religious traditions, that is Christianity and even Judaism in the Mendelssohn case, with ideas of freedom, toleration, natural rights, pluralism, while not renouncing their tradition, right? And there was another more, especially in the French case, a more negative take on religion, because religion was perceived as hopelessly oppressive. So we have to overthrow that. Now, I said, in my view, these are very interesting for Islam, because a lot of the discussions Christians or Europeans had back then, a few centuries ago, are now going on in the world of Islam. Should we punish blasphemy? Should we consider apostasy as a crime? Should government keep people from committing sin or impose a true religious doctrine on others, and so on and so forth? There are Muslims who say yes. Some of them have governments and regimes established. There are other Muslims who are saying no. And some of those who say no are just, they don't want religion much. I mean, they're more secular people. I respect that. That's a point of view. But there are also people like me who are religious, who are respectful to the core of the religion, but who see a lot of problems in its oppressive interpretation. So I found very much affinity with the Lockean perspective. And then other, not me, but other fellow Muslim liberals, as I would say. We have conversations about, did you read Locke? Did you read Pierre Bayle? Did you read this and that period? Now, in the West now, these things are being rediscussed because there's a heritage of the Enlightenment. But I think the most valuable component in the Enlightenment for me, as a source of inspiration, that's the religious Enlightenment, as I put in the piece. That is also being forgotten to some extent by different groups going toward different directions. On the one hand, there are the new atheists or the new secularists or sometimes the woke left in a different way, they say, religion is terrible. We have to overthrow it, and anything that comes. I mean, the woke left actually rejects the Enlightenment too as the issue of as a work of white men. But there is a kind of a negative take on religion, and religion is seen as oppressive. And then there are religious figures who say, "Oh, the Enlightenment was a big mistake. It brought us to this degenerate society, or loss of values, destruction of family," and the integralists, the post-liberal Christians. And I think both sides are missing this great synthesis that the religious Enlightenment allowed flourish, first in England, then in the United States, which is a religious society, a largely religious society, still appreciative of religion, and wants to thrive religiously, not through government coercion, but through civil society, which means through liberty. And I want the West to keep that synthesis, because if it's not there, there's not much to talk about. As an example, in the Muslim world as well. So my interest in the religious enlightenment of the West and its value partly comes from my conviction that the Islamic civilization is at a phase that we need exactly that, and not to copy that, but take that as a source of inspiration to offer an enlightenment with our own religious sources and it's our own reinterpretations, of course.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that you do in the essay, you cite historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, and there's this quote from the essay that you wrote: "While the French political tradition has been excessively preoccupied with reason," she argued, "the British and American ones focus on individual liberty while also extolling social virtues promoted by religion. Those are compassion, benevolence, and sympathy." So you alluded to kind of differing takes or differing strands of the Enlightenment. I guess my question to you, Mustafa, is what do you think we need to do in order to kind of revive what Himmelfarb pointed out to, but these social virtues that are promoted by religion, compassion, benevolence, sympathy? There are others I'm sure you could name. Is it just simply a matter of reminding each other, reminding ourselves that this is kind of the part of the roots of the American experiment, if you want to call it that? What does that look like?
Well, that's $1 million question, right? But just I would say that as an observer of the United States. Now I'm living in the United States. God bless America for that. I'm lucky for that. Shifted my life. I used to live in Turkey. I mean, I'm from Turkey. Much of my life was in Turkey. Now I'm in the U.S. And like 30 years ago, when I wrote in Turkish to fellow Turks in newspaper columns and or in talks, I used to say, well, look, we are a country saturated with political zealotry and very divisive and hate-filled language. People don't want to leave power. There are coup attempts, and there are a lot of conspiracy theories. Look at America. These things don't happen there. That was my argument. And I was referring to this political culture where, presidents would come and say, when they're leaving, they would say they wish good luck for the next president. He's my rival, but I respect him. He's a good man. And so there was a kind of a civic culture of certain courtesy, some civic language, and so on and so forth. It's certainly declined in the United States, and we've seen that, in the past 10 years. Conspiracy theories became so popular in American political culture. Now, which means these things are fragile, right? I mean, you cannot take a good culture, whatever is there, as permanent. Now, how do you push back against that? One thing, there is some attractiveness, some sexiness, if you will, to zealotry and being vicious and fanaticism, especially in the social media. People use nasty language and demonize their opponents, get clicks of millions and that kind of stuff. So, but that ultimately exhausts itself. I mean, there's not much value there. I think people who value traditional norms of civility and courtesy and rule of law and respect to certain norms, human dignity, respect to the dignity of the other person, even if you strongly disagree on certain things. I think we should stand by against this kind of zealotry and this cruel culture of just insults and nasty language and conspiracy theories and all that. We should just say, this is what we rather believe in. We disagree with our opponents, we criticize them, but we consider them as fellow citizens, fellow human beings, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, because cultures, especially in the US, but they go back and forth, right? I mean, there was a sexual revolution in the 60s, and there was some more interest in family values later. People saw that just doing whatever your desires ask you to do just doesn't lead you to really any happiness. Because ultimately, I believe people become happy when they believe that they are doing the right thing for their family, for their community, for the others, not through somebody coercing them, but through their own genuine will and through their own genuine convictions. And I think there is a drive against it. Fanaticism is the name of the game, and militancy and just hating the other side is the name of the game. But I think people who are fed up with this and who want to preserve values should just not buy into this and present a better version of what people forgot. So that's, I think, one thing we can do. Another thing is people who are worried about where society is going, they generally want to find a solution through the government, right? Oh, let's grab the government. Let's make everybody, through government coercion or institutional coercion, buy into our woke culture or whatever that is, this. Or let's take it back from the woke. That's one of the politicians are saying today, right? I mean, let's take it back. Let's use this institutionalized state and this establishment. Let's use it for our own end. Somebody has to use it. Let it be us. Instead, let's focus on keeping the government limited, making it more limited. So I think that will bring in some ease to culture wars in America, because I see that it's all about who captures the state power and who captures the courts to bring in their own worldview. The more we, I think, keep the government limited, which was one of the great blessings of Enlightenment, liberalism. I mean, not every straight in Enlightenment, but classical liberalism is all about keeping the government limited. So people with very diverse values, beliefs, convictions can live at peace at a government just who protects their natural rights. I think that is also being lost by both on the left and on the right. And we should therefore certainly assert that heritage of limited government and equality under the law.
And you are, after all, at the Cato Institute for good reason. So something very
exactly.
on brand there.
It's not an accident. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. I mean, that conversation, I mean, it's one that we have at the Dispatch all the time. And I'm just curious, your perspective as a Muslim, how you approach the Enlightenment and particularly how your worldview, coming from your perspective, helps you think about the Enlightenment, maybe things you pick up on Enlightenment thinking or principles that maybe others of us Christians like myself or others maybe don't. But I'm just curious how you would, how you kind of think through or approach the Enlightenment. And I would just say, too, I think there are probably a fair number of people who would say, Islam is incompatible with Enlightenment principles, which I don't necessarily think is a fair argument myself, but I'm sure that's something that you've contended with in the past.
Yeah. Well, people said Catholicism is not compatible with Enlightenment for a long time. Some people said Judaism is not as well. And actually, that's why Moses Mendelssohn wrote his book, Jerusalem, which I, again, read with fascination a while ago. And I discussed that in my forthcoming book as well. Because they said Judaism is a legalistic religion and Christianity came without any coercion, any theocratic state at the beginning, but Judaism did. And Moses Mendelssohn, the great 18th century liberal Jewish thinker, wrote a response to that, which are the things we're discussing today. I think, now I will say one thing, if you compare Christianity and Islam, people just, say, some people say that, and some people say this critically, some people say this proudly, that Islam has been a more political religion from the very beginning. There's this argument. And I would say, yeah, there's some truth to that, in the sense that when Jesus Christ preached his message, his good news. He was just a preacher. He was not a statesman. He was not a soldier. He was not a general of an army.
Mm-hmm.
He just gave his message, and he was killed by the state, crucified. And then his followers spread the message for a few centuries without having a state of their own, without any armies and any. So only when Christianity became the state religion in the Roman Empire in the early 4th century, Christianity started to go coercive. And then you have a whole 1,000 years of crusades and inquisitions and certain oppressive laws and intra-Christian and anti-Semitism too, by the way. So, but an Enlightenment was somewhat a correction to that heritage, right? Just bringing Christianity back to, and again, Enlightenment had different strains, but the component I find valuable in the Enlightenment was giving up religious power in the Christian world gradually, not suddenly. But so Islam from the beginning had a state. I mean, not in the beginning, but Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as would say, also began peacefully preaching Islam in the early 7th century to polytheist Arabs. They persecuted him and his followers. Because of that, they fled and also had to initiate a military campaign because of persecution. But that campaign didn't end, and Islam grew to be a state, and that state turned into an empire in a century. So there is a difference in the founding of both religions, that you have a theocratic, if you will, state in the beginning of Islam. In the Christianity, you don't have that. That's why if you read the New Testament and the Quran, you will find more passages in the Quran compared to the New Testament, not the Old, but the New Testament, that are more about politics, legislation, and war and violence and all that. But this doesn't mean Muslims cannot look back and say this experience in the beginning of religion is not a political blueprint that we have to follow all the time. I mean, Islamists, the people called Islams, they believe that. They believe that Prophet Muhammad established a state. We have to establish a state. It's called the Khilafah, Caliphate, with Sharia, something that looks like the Taliban or maybe other versions of it. So there are people who believe in that. I argue against those people. But there are other Muslims who say, hey, look, the reason why the Prophet established a state is because he was persecuted. If he was not persecuted, that would not be even necessary. It was for Islam to survive. What we need in the modern world today is not Islamic states, all of which turn to be dictatorships of one or the other sect. What we need is states that give us freedom. So there are millions and hundreds of millions of Muslims who would be convinced by this argument, and that's why they prefer to live in freer societies.
And to be fair, I mean, pre-Enlightenment, it's awfully hard to imagine. It's awfully hard to imagine nation states surviving as we imagine them now, because there was some. I mean, what option did Muslims have in terms of finding freedom of religion anywhere else that they would have turned at that point, right?
Exactly. I mean, I had that conversation. I just made that point with a conversation with Sheikh Yasser Qadhi, who's a prominent Islamic religious leader in the U.S., an imam in Texas, and he's more conservative than me, but we had a very respectful conversation on this. And I mean, he was reminding that all our tradition thought you need a caliphate to practice Islam. And I said, well, if I lived 6 centuries ago, I would think like that too. What's the alternative? You either live under an Islamic state that protects you as your caliph, or you cannot expect to go to London and have an Islamic cultural center or mosque or something like that. It was the Christian, the Crusaders. That's the enemy territory. So you thought a state from your religion, based on your religion, is the only political medium that you need. Christians would think like that. But that's the value of the Enlightenment. I mean, ultimately, one of the big values of the Enlightenment is the idea of a secular state. Now, it wasn't necessarily called secular in the beginning, and secular can go to different directions, but I would call it a religiously neutral state, a state that doesn't uphold this doctrine or that church through Christianity, whether Protestantism or Catholicism. And no, the state that protects natural rights. That's why actually natural rights and natural law thinking is important as well. It also brings a sense of common humanity. I mean, we have these religions, religious traditions, but there's something common to all of us. We can reason through that and agree on some certain political or legal norms, some values. So I think that was also an important emphasis of the Enlightenment. So that's a new phenomenon in world history. And you compare world history with what are based on the alternatives. So definitely, so I see Enlightenment as a major step forward in human history towards freedom. Again, the Enlightenment had bad sides too. I wouldn't think very positively of it if I were living under the Jacobins during the French Revolution. But the better side, the more liberal side of the Enlightenment, I think ultimately gave us liberal democracies of today, where everybody is equal under the law. And interestingly, some Muslims who live in these liberal democracies and say, this is a terrible system, liberalism is bad, they still live in these places. I mean, they don't go and live in, I don't know, Kandahar or somewhere. I mean, you can criticize liberalism within still liberalism as vocal as you are, which is actually one of the reasons to think that there is something good about freedom, a political system based on freedom, which is what liberalism is to me.
Sure. Well, I mean, kind of continuing to turn to that topic a little bit, I guess. You wrote in the piece for us in July, to be fair and precise, the Islamic civilization is a very complex and diverse part of the world with varying political, social, and religious structures. Some Muslim-majority nations are doing much better than others, and some, such as Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania, are as free as most other European states. To your point, things are very complex. I think you wrote a piece a few months ago, too, for Foreign Policy, basically arguing that the present conflict in Gaza and the way that the U.S. and other Western nations are kind of approaching that conflict is really pushing more liberal-minded Muslims away from some of these principles that we're talking about. So I would invite you to pick up on that strain if you want. But I guess one question I have is, you mentioned Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania. Are there things going on in Muslim-majority nations right now that for probably a lot of Americans who keep up with the news and are watching what's going on with Iran or paying attention to Yemen or Saudi relations with Israel and whatnot, are there things going on in Muslim-majority countries with regard to some of these principles that you think many Americans may not understand or realize are the reality at the moment?
Well, I mentioned those two countries in Eastern Europe partly because, for a few things. First of all, when you ask an average American, where is the Muslim world? Which countries do you know as Muslim majority countries? They will say Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, mostly countries in the Middle East. It never occurs to them there are some countries that are in Europe, but also Muslim majority. And Bosnia-Herzegovina is one of them. Albania is another one. Kosovo is another one, the third one. And my wife is from Bosnia, so I have a history there as well. But what is interesting about those countries is that they are the most free Muslim majority countries in terms of freedom of speech, religion, other personal freedoms. And we know this from the Human Freedom Index that Cato Institute publishes every year. In a couple of years, I published a small report, again by Cato, based on our Human Freedom Index, showing into Muslim majority countries. How free are they? And it turned out that the freest were Albania and Bosnia. And of course, the least free ones were Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Yemen because of the civil war too. So there's a huge spectrum in this Muslim majority world. So what I wanted to remind is that when we're speaking about the Muslim world or the Islamic world, it's actually a very diverse place. There are about 50 Muslim majority states. Only about a dozen of them impose Sharia, Islamic law, in the criminal code, which is what the controversy is mostly about, right? I mean, things like apostasy punishments or blasphemy punishments or adultery and laws like that. So they are not the case. They're not the case in all across the Muslim world. Now, I'm saying this because sometimes people say, "Oh my God, Muslims will come and establish Sharia in the middle of Texas." Well, they have to establish it first in Algeria or Kazakhstan first. I mean, even in Muslim majority countries, you don't have that sort of necessarily Sharia-based legal systems because there's been a lot of modernization in the modern period. In Turkey, where I come from, laws are secular. I mean, they're not Islamic law. Despite the soft Islamization of the past 20 years, it still didn't go to a legal level. So just reminding these, I think, complexities are important. And many Muslims are happy with the secular states that they have. Maybe they're unhappy with corruption or nepotism or political authoritarianism, but they're not necessarily asking for a Sharia-based alternative. Nobody is necessarily asking for a Taliban-like alternative in the Balkans, or if some people do, it's a very small minority. So I just wanted to bring these, sometimes remind these basic facts, because the discussion about Islam is sometimes between a caricature of the Taliban versus the free societies of the West. It's much more complex than that, and there are 2 billion Muslims out there. Hundreds of millions of them are already in favor of free societies with secular governments and rule of law and freedom for everyone. And that means there's not an irreconcilable tension.
Right.
Now, religious thinking is a different thing. Islamic thinking, and there you have a spectrum as well. There are certainly conservative authorities who would be illiberal on many issues, on women's rights or on religious freedom or freedom of speech. They would not be necessarily extremist, but they would be illiberal. And then there are the extremist edge, which is threatening, of course, all of us. These are the terrorist, violent groups. But then there is what I would call a reformist religious thinking, and I'm operating in that realm in terms of dealing with ideas. There you have exactly the John Locke sort of approach to religion. Yes, this is our religious tradition. We believe in its core. We believe in the Prophet. We believe in the Quran. But we understand that not everything in our religious law is applicable today, or we need reform. We need reform of blasphemy laws or apostasy laws. And why is that? I mean, does the Quran say this? Did the Prophet say this? There are endless discussions about these things. But there is certainly a reformist thinking in religious circles as well. And then there are the Muslims who are cultural Muslims, who are not even that too interested in religion. So I think seeing that diversity would be helpful to anyone who's speaking about the state of the Islamic civilization today and in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Locke actually referred to the Ottoman Empire and the toleration found within the Ottoman Empire, right? So that seems like the way that some of these undulations play out, I guess it's not strictly linear. I think you had a line in the essay, not in the Dispatch Faith essay. You actually wrote a piece for us back in the spring, referring to Richard Dawkins, and you wrote, he is just observing Christianity at its most liberal and relaxed stage, while observing Islam as one of its most illiberal and anxious ones. So everything is not strictly linear, I guess, in terms of how they play out. There are, because of the complexities, different strains play out at different times in different places, right?
Exactly. I mean, just a few centuries ago, nobody would criticize Islam for lack of freedom, right? If there was a major burning lack of freedom, that was the European continent. That was 16th century, 17th century Europe. The Protestants and Catholics were killing each other. Jews were routinely persecuted. That's why minorities escaped from Europe to the lands of Islam in those centuries. Jews are the quintessential example. When they were forced to convert to Catholicism in 15th century Spain at the time of Columbus, they migrated to different parts of the world, but especially to Muslim lands and the Ottoman Empire. And where they flourished became the Sephardic community of the Ottoman Empire, which is still in Turkey today, at least their descendants, some of them. I know, for example, some heretical Christians in Europe, Huguenots, Unitarians, escaped Europe to the Ottoman Empire, which was relatively more free at the time. But today, people escape from the lands of Islam to the West, right? Ahmadis, Jews most of them have been expelled anyway, or Christians or other Yazidis and other groups. So I'm just telling this history to both the West and the Muslim world today, to the West, to say, look, it's not that you are by definition free and Islam is by definition oppressive. No, it's just a bad time in that side. Then I'm telling to Muslims, saying that, hey, look, we can be proud of our more tolerant heritage, but we're far from that today. And we should understand why, and why our lands are not the lands of free speech and free thought and diversity today. That's also true for philosophy. Muslims read Aristotle and Plato and translated them into Arabic and they gave it to Europe through the route of Spain 1,000 years ago. And that's a great heritage that we should be proud of. They added to that philosophical tradition as well. But today, if you want to learn philosophy, I mean, you don't go to Riyadh. I mean, you don't go to Islamabad. So, and we should think why. So that's one of my arguments I keep bringing.
Sure. Well, I want to transition a little bit. Like I referenced earlier, you do have a book coming out here in a couple of weeks from the time we're recording this. The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. I'm going to take a page out of Jonah Goldberg's book and just ask you to tee up very simply, what's the book about?
Well, the book is about, it's in one sense, it's a sequel to the Islamic Jesus that I published 7 years ago, again with St. Martin's Press. This one is titled The Islamic Moses. But it uses the Moses story in the Quran as a hook to just enter into a bigger story. And the bigger story in the book is what I call the Judeo-Islamic tradition. Now, people may be familiar with the term Judeo-Christian, right? But maybe less so Judeo-Islamic, because there is a recognition that Christianity came out of Judaism, universalized many of its concepts, and the two religions are intricately connected, which is true. But I think it's exactly true for Islam as well. I tell in the book that there's a reason why the most dominant human figure in the whole Quran is not Muhammad himself, but Prophet Moses. He is the role model for Muhammad. And when you read the Quran, you learn about Moses and his leadership to the Israelites and his defeating of the Pharaoh more than anything else. And I begin from there to tell how a lot of ideas that were originally historically in Judaism, monotheism, legal tradition, dietary laws, they actually were inherited by Islam, historically speaking, and then brought to the Gentiles. I mean, there are scholars who define Islam as Judaism for Gentiles, right? I mean, I discuss why they said that. And then I get into the better history of Jews and Muslims, because as I said, until the modern conflict in the Middle East, Jews and Muslims historically did well together. There were many times that Jews flourished in Muslim lands, that's in Muslim Spain, lately then in the Ottoman Empire, and preferred living there to a then less liberal Christendom at the time. So there are many stories and episodes there. I discuss how Jewish and Islamic scholars, actually like Maimonides on one side and Ibn Rushd Averroes on the other side, looked into issues of natural law or toleration, or how each religion look at the other side, how philosophy and theology in each side influence each other. So it's a book which basically implies that the terrible conflict we see in the Middle East, and which escalated terribly since that doomsday on October 7th, is not a irreconcilable and inevitable war between Muslims and Jews that's been going on for centuries. No, it's a political conflict which we can hopefully still resolve by a political solution. And Jews and Muslims have an even bigger story than that, right? They have a bigger heritage to refer to for building peace. I also show that, I mean, they have similar religious freedom issues. I mean, if you go to Europe today, you will see conservative Muslims and conservative Jews taking similar stances against some intrusive progressive governments, like which ban the headscarf or the kippah, or halal and kosher slaughter. Even there's a movement to ban male circumcision, which brings Muslims and Jews together, for example, in Europe. And in America, some some with these far right militants who target both the synagogues and the mosques. So there are common threats as well. So people see Islam and Judaism through the lens of today's conflict, the terrible conflict between Israel and Palestine and Gaza today. But my book tells a brighter story of Muslims and Jews and Islam and Judaism over the centuries. So yeah, that's what the Islamic Moses is about.
Very good. Well, Mustafa, thanks so much for joining me today. Again, thanks for your written work for us at the Dispatch, but thanks for what you do in general too. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to talk to you. It's always a pleasure to write for Dispatch. Thanks for having me today as well.